Brett Kavanaugh, a trade war with China, and NATO versus Russia. I'm Adam Byrne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Byrne. Joining us today are conservative commentator Valerie Greenfeld, Zaid Jilani of The Intercept, and Rachel Tripp of Young Voices. Welcome, everyone. Judge Brett Kavanaugh of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has won President Trump's single red rose for nomination to the Supreme Court, and now he faces what's likely to be a protracted battle for his confirmation in the Senate. So, Valerie Greenfeld, how do you think a Justice Kavanaugh would shape the Supreme Court?
I think he's a great choice. And I think one of the smartest things that Trump did was he made a list before he was elected so that the United States, all the citizens know it's somebody here on this list. It's not going to be any surprises. Justice Kavanaugh, he's a kind of a true blue American. He went to Yale. He loves baseball. He loves beer. So beyond his brilliance and all of his brains, he's able to really. I think he'll have no problem with the hearings because he'll relate well to most of the senators.
On that list that you mentioned, Valerie, isn't it true that that list really was brought up by people like the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation? So isn't it true that they're really picking Brett Kavanaugh and not President Trump?
I think like many of any president's people around him that give advice, he has a choice. He can say no to anybody. He can say yes. He can make his own choice. These are just examples or suggestions. And in the end, it's his decision.
Okay. And how do you see it?
I think that hopefully future Supreme Justice Kavanaugh is a wonderful choice. I think that he's someone who has a proven history of ruling in terms of seeing the Constitution as written. I think this is a great victory for those of us who believe that the Constitution should be adhered to as written and that the role of the Supreme Court is to uphold the law as written, as opposed to maybe some others who believe that it should be the judges themselves making the law.
Okay. Excellent. Jilani, do you share their optimism about this nomination?
Well, it's interesting because he basically needs unanimous GOP caucus to be confirmed, or he needs a few Democratic defectors. Remember that 3 Democratic senators voted for Gorsuch. With respect to the Constitution, you have to remember that, for instance, Justice Kavanaugh was part of a decision that actually helped dismiss a lawsuit against NSA mass surveillance in 2013 when we had libertarian Republicans like Rand Paul and Justin Amash kind of protesting that, a number of other folks in the House. So I'm not so sure I would just go ahead and write off, and say that Kavanaugh is totally for the Constitution. I imagine that, like any other justice, his views will be interrogated very fiercely, and I think that the Republicans shouldn't exactly declare before there even being a hearing that they'll vote for or against him. And that goes for the Democrats as well, and the 2 independents. But I do think there needs to be a lot of introspection here, because you have to remember, our Supreme Court doesn't even have term limits. It doesn't have age limits like the Canadian Supreme Court does. This guy, well, he's a little bit on the younger side. He'll be there for decades, right? We need to have a real interrogation of his worldview a little bit, and I haven't really seen that. And the fact that he drinks beer and went to Yale is not the most relevant part about the decisions he'll make. So
I agree with you. It's not the most relevant part. What I meant was he will be able to relate to the senators who he's going to be speaking with one-on-one before the hearings start. And I think that will be helpful to both sides to understand who he is and what he believes in. And on your comment about the weight of the Senate and the House, who's going to be voting, I agree with you, and I'm hoping that Joe Manchin will be somebody on the Democratic side that will come over to vote in favor of justice. And as you said, it's a tight rope. Maybe we can get Susan Collins to come over. She hasn't made a decision yet, but it might be close with her. And I believe it was John McCain who won't be able to be present. I don't know if he'll be able to be present personally, but I know that he was in favor. So you're right. It's going to be close, but I hope in the end justice will win.
So Rachel Tripp, what right do you think Republicans have to put this nomination through before the midterm elections when Mitch McConnell blocked President Obama from putting through Merrick Garland's nomination before the last presidential election.
I think that there's been a lot of discussion around whether or not we should move forward with this confirmation hearing, given the investigations that have been going on with the administration. But I think that there's a precedent for having done so. Bill Clinton was under investigation for years and elected and nominated many federal judges during his 6 years of investigation that all went through and were confirmed. So I think that we have a historical precedent of acting in that way.
Okay, and there some speculation about President Trump picking Kavanaugh because he had written an opinion saying that presidents should not be under the threat of criminal prosecution while they're in office. Do you think that played a part?
I mean, it seemed like that angle was a little exaggerated to me. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said. And it's not entirely clear to me why President Trump picked it. We do know that he was in that list of 25 that he had composed at some point. I would say on the sort of the legislative squeamishness, the Democrats are going to try to make a process argument that they didn't get their pick. And then the Republicans are going to, Mitch McConnell is one of the more shape-shifting politicians out there. He'll be on every side of an issue, but at the end of the day, he's trying to do what's good for his party and on his ideology. So I think arguing that it's hypocritical or something, I mean, it probably is hypocritical. The Republicans probably did basically deny Obama a court pick just for the heck of it, but they're legally allowed to do that, and they maximized the power that was legally allowed to them. And I think Democrats need to realize that, rather than trying to make a hypocrisy argument, because at the end of the day, everyone's kind of a hypocrite in politics. I mean, that's the process. But it's about getting that power for your base, and I think the Republicans did that effectively, and this court pick is an example of that.
And I think putting justices on the Supreme Court has been something that Republicans have been very happy with President Trump for, whereas perhaps they've not been as happy with issues like trade and some of other President Trump's actions. So is that the trade-off that you're looking for?
I'm not looking for a trade-off at all. I'm looking to win every issue. And I think that Trump is too. I mean, he's the guy that negotiates, and he's the guy that wants to make a win out of every issue.
Okay. Well, I'd like to remind our viewers now that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter, and we'll answer as many as we can on air towards the end of the show. Also this week, the US trade war with China is now in full swing. Here's the story from Al Jazeera.
China has always promised it will match exactly US tariffs with its own list. $34 billion worth of goods will be affected, from farm products to automobiles, chemicals and medical equipment. As those US products become more expensive, China has been looking for other countries to supply them. In so doing, say critics of the US policy, Beijing has been forging deeper trade links with US competitors.
So, is this more about the economy or is it more about politics, Rachel Tripp?
I think that this is largely about politics, at least when it comes to President Trump's latest threat of the latest round of tariffs that will add billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to tariffs that have already been imposed. But I think he's playing a pretty dangerous game. I think he is playing what he believes to be a political game in terms of trying to change the Chinese markets and having them allow different restrictions or different regulations to be lifted from American businesses. But in doing so, he is actually harming not only our domestic markets, but also the global markets as well. China can't retaliate in the way that they have done by matching these tariffs because they're so high and because the import-export between our two countries is so skewed. But they can retaliate in other ways that could be pretty drastic.
So, Zaid, Jilani, what chance are there that this political move, as Rachel suggests, might backfire economically?
Well, it's really interesting. Trade wars are not totally abnormal in U.S. history. I remember Bush had a dispute with the European Union, and the European Union responded by threatening to place tariffs on states like Florida, like on Florida's produce. So that's what I'm curious about, if China's going to respond in that way, and that they're actually going to go after politically vulnerable states and their economies in order to kind of change Trump's mind, if it is a political calculation, because that's not something that we haven't seen before. On the merits of it, I do think there are some arguments about the way that China does have certain protectionist policies. I feel maybe Trump feels like he's asserting himself against that by responding with tariffs. Whether it would actually work out, I guess we'll kind of have to see. But I do generally think that the way the news media has played it has been a little bit alarmist. Countries do use tariffs against each other. We do see back and forth on trade between, under every president. I believe Barack Obama had imposed new tariffs. George W. Bush did. Ronald Reagan imposed huge steel tariffs. The question is whether they actually are willing to pull back if things go south. And, we don't know exactly how savvy of a negotiator the president is. I think he claims he is quite a savvy negotiator, but we'll see.
Yes, well, the president claimed that winning a trade war with China would be easy. Do you think that's the case?
Well, if you believe that there is a trade war, I think that this is just part of the regular negotiation that Trump usually does. He sometimes starts out too strongly, and then the media might up the ante a bit. But I think with regard to China, Trump wants free and fair trade. And we haven't really had fair trade with China for decades. And it's time that somebody stands up and says, you know, we don't want a deficit anymore. We want it to be fair so that everybody profits.
But isn't that just the nature of the world economy, that one country's going to buy more and one's going to sell more than the other? It's perfectly
Absolutely,
natural.
you're right. It's just that when it's vastly uneven, then there's need to be some adjustments, and I think that's what Trump is after.
Okay.
And I think it's fair. You know, we've been taken advantage of, in my opinion, by China for decades, and now finally Trump is doing something about it instead of just letting it go and continuing to perpetuate the deficit. And
that's certainly the politics behind it. To Zaid Jilani's point, Rachel, about the potential Chinese counter-reaction to this.
Yes.
Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, has already raised his concern about soybean manufacturers in his home state. So do you think with China targeting specifically at that kind of market, will that concern Republicans generally?
I think we will see a immediate harm to the American consumer, but first we will see a harm to the American farmer, to the American exporter, the companies who are manufacturing these goods that previously were being shipped to China at what is now a very different rate. If these tariffs were to be approved, and I think that it shows Congress's potential concern around these new tariffs, that they have requested a policy where they do have to approve new tariffs at this point. I think that if they do that, then the Chinese have a very real ability to intentionally hold up American companies and imports in a way that will no longer allow them to be profitable. Cherries is another great example of this. We have already seen cherry manufacturers who are sending cherries to Asia, specifically to China, and they're being held up for what is now new regulatory inspections just long enough for them to spoil, right? So that is a great example of completely lost money, lost resources, all going away from the pocket of the United States.
And Zaid Jilani, how do you think we got to this point where you have a president who's really going against what his party believes in trade when it comes to free trade versus tariffs?
Well, I think part of it is that President Trump doesn't have a whole lot of ideological conviction. He had the reverse opinion on a number of issues 5 or 10 years ago. But I think this is something where he consistently, over a set of decades, had criticized a number of the FTAs. He had criticized China's role in trade. And he appointed someone who's actually fairly ideological. It was that professor out in California, Peter Navarro, to run a lot of his trade policy. And his USTR rep, by the way, I think also is in favor of some changes, a long time in favor of some changes to trade. So I think this is an issue where he really has actually deep conviction. I mean, you might not say he has very deep conviction on like religion. You know, when he tries to talk about the Bible, sometimes it's a little bit odd. He's trying to adjust himself to being a Republican. But I think here, he actually really believes this. And, you know, maybe it's more his belief than politics in this case.
Okay, well, we'll see how it does shape up economically. But finally tonight, President Trump's ruffled some feathers at the NATO summit in Brussels, reiterating his demand that NATO members spend more on defence and accusing Germany of being controlled by Russia. And this all comes before a meeting between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. So, Zaid Jilani, why is President Trump picking a fight with NATO allies when he's about to visit the leader of NATO's main adversary?
Well, I think President Trump at some point adopted basically a nationalistic framework where he said that other countries are taking advantage of us. And he got it in his head that, you know, NATO spends a certain amount on defense and they don't spend enough on defense. And that his negotiation strategy tends to be to escalate on the front end, meaning he'll berate them publicly, he'll say a number of things, and then he'll back down. He did that with North Korea, for instance, you know, where he was almost to the point of threatening war, and now he's like buddy-buddy. So it may end up being the same thing with NATO. Obviously, some other people's take on it would be that he's just way too friendly to Putin. He's like ideologically captured by Putin. That's why he's being sort of abrasive towards NATO. Although we should remember that Trump has done a number of things. For instance, he has sent lethal arms to Ukraine. He canceled the Iran deal. He launched some strikes on Syria's government. He's done a number of things that Putin himself wouldn't like either. So I don't know, if I was Putin, I'd kind of would be hoping for Obama back on some days. So it's kind of hard to read exactly what Trump is doing. But I think certainly it's very unusual. It's very unusual for a U.S. president to be publicly calling out allies in this way. Normally when they have these kind of disputes, it's done behind closed doors. But I guess Trump has, you know, a different style.
Rachel, Tripp, how do you see that style impacting the relationship between Trump and NATO and Russia?
Sure. Well, when it comes to leaders of the free, or depending on your perspective, slightly less free world meeting, I think it's always better to have conversations, or start to have conversations, over immediately going to an arms race. I think anything that we can do to have a civil discussion, to engage in civil discourse, is a positive thing. When it comes to NATO, I think that President Trump does have this mentality that his goal is for the benefit of America, and what he views the benefit of America to be is something that is different from the way that NATO has entered into expectations with us, and he would like to see a different approach. Personally, I think that NATO in general, the allocation of resources by a forced, overpowering organization is not a good way to have global rule, but I think President Trump does agree on that.
Valerie Greenfeld, before he left the summit in Brussels, President Trump said that he had gotten a commitment from other nations to raise their spending beyond the 2% that's already been agreed to, 2% of GDP. But no nations have made any new commitments. Why do you think he said that?
Well, perhaps there were some things said behind closed doors that the media hasn't been told yet. I don't know. But I know that originally it was supposed to be 2% per country. We are paying, in the United States, 3.6%. Not to mention we give about $100 billion a year with military stations that we have in Germany, for example. And I think that adds to the 3.6%. So really we're giving a lot more than it seems. And I think Trump is trying to get it up to 4% per country. And countries like Germany should certainly have no problem doing that. And so it's just a matter of, I guess, at this point, time. But, Trump really tries to, in my opinion, he runs the NATO and these other organizations as a business. This is what he knows, and this is the way he thinks. And I think it's all about numbers and the bottom line and what he can get to make everything happen.
Is that appropriate when it comes to collective defense, to run it like a business?
Well, I think the fact is that the United States gives a lot more money in NATO, in UN, in many organizations. And it's time to make some adjustments, because there are countries like Germany that can certainly afford to pay more of their fair share.
Okay, and when it comes to Germany, of course, President Trump famously making this accusation that Germany is controlled by Russia by getting 70% of its energy from Russia, when that's not true. The figure's actually below 20%. But why would he do that?
Well, I think President Trump could use getting a new flow of information sometimes. Maybe he needs to think about the news sources he's consuming, the advisors he's talking to. On this issue of 2 or 4%, though, there's a good compromise here, which is that maybe everybody should lower their defense spending down to 2%. Maybe the U.S. should spend 2% of our GDP on defense. That way we'd be spending more. We wouldn't be spending money defending fronts that don't really make sense anymore in Europe or in other parts of the world. And the Europeans don't have to spend more then. Then everyone can spend less. Then we're not being taken advantage of anymore. I mean, I think that's a solution maybe someone should offer to President Trump, and I think Germany would accommodate that.
Okay, and looking forward to, you don't think so?
I disagree. I don't think spending is the issue in terms of how much money is given. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have the security that we need. And I agree that perhaps we should get out of Germany, since they're doing business with Russia instead of with us. Maybe they don't need us anymore, and that's okay. But I think in general, everybody's got to do a little bit more fending for themselves.
Okay. Well, now it's time to take some questions from our viewers, and our first one comes from Jeanette Gordon, who asks, it's on the Supreme Court nomination, saying, if Kavanaugh has not issued a decision on abortion, why are we so sure he would overturn Roe versus Wade? It's a topic we've not quite picked up on.
We're not sure. And I don't think that there should be a litmus test on any of our candidates for the Supreme Court. And also, the way the process works is the area, whatever it is, if it's abortion, it has to come up through the lower courts, and then the Supreme Court has to agree that they're going to take the case. And I think it's so controversial that I couldn't imagine that they would take the case. I think that in general, it will probably stay the way it is.
Rachel Tripp, do you agree? Do you think the Supreme Court will be itching to take on Roe versus Wade or not?
I don't think so, and I think that this concern over Roe v. Wade with this particular nominee is one that's unfounded. I think that in the one case where he was involved with a abortion ruling, he ordered against it, he ruled against it, but not based on the concern that many have that it was based in religious principles. Instead, he actually was concerned about the rights of the immigrant who was the case holder in question. And so I think that concerning ourselves with a case or a concept that hasn't come to fruition yet is much less relevant than being sure that we have someone on the bench who's going to rule with judicial restraint.
Okay, and critics, of course, would point out that President Trump doesn't need to ask about Roe versus Wade because of that list that we mentioned earlier, those societies making sure that it's someone they think would rule against it. Zaid, Jilani, we'll come to you for our second question, which is from Dexter Jackson, who asks, if you were a senator on the Judiciary Committee, what would you ask Judge Kavanaugh?
Well, one, I think the First Amendment is a bedrock principle of the United States, and I would really interrogate Justice Kavanaugh about what he thinks the First Amendment should actually cover. I mean, in recent years, we've seen the First Amendment redefined into saying that we're allowing unlimited political spending in our political system, which is not how most Americans think about free speech. It's certainly not how most of the world thinks about free speech. And that's been a burgeoning issue, not only with the Citizens United decision, but with previous decisions that allowed, for instance, individuals to spend personally unlimited amounts of money and destroyed spending cap limits, which was decades before Citizens United. So, really I would interrogate him on where he sees the line between money and speech, if there is a line. Because right now we do have more or less the potential of a conservative majority that sees no distinction between the two things.
Okay, Valerie, if you were playing senator, what would you be asking?
I agree. That's a good question to ask about the First Amendment. And I would, in addition to that, I would ask specifically about online freedom of speech. Where is the line between incitement and freedom of speech when it comes to, terrorism and radicalizing our young Americans? I think that the laws are very unclear right now, and that we need to have some basis to make better decisions on that area. And also, I think the Second Amendment, and we never really talk about so much, but I think that's also a very important area that I would ask him about.
Okay, and just very quickly, we'll come to you as well for yours.
For me, I would say that it's less about a particular case or even a particular policy issue and more about the philosophy behind it. Many people believe that judges on the Supreme Court can make policy, and many believe that they should interpret the law as written. I would want to hope that Judge Kavanaugh was in that second camp.
Okay. So now it's time for the most underreported story of the week, where our guests get to pick what they think hasn't been paid enough attention to. Who would like to start?
I'll start.
Jump in. Go on.
I'll start. So this week there is a new poll out that Jeff Deal, who is the endorsed Republican Senate candidate for Senate in Massachusetts, he's running against Elizabeth Warren. He is actually leading Elizabeth Warren in the polling over independents, which has huge significance for such a blue state and one that has historically had a very hard time electing Republican officials.
Okay, so we'll see how Elizabeth Warren gets on. Zaid, Jilani, your most underreported story?
Yeah, there's actually some policy being debated in the House through committee. There's a party line vote that would actually allow the federal government to withhold some funds to agencies that don't allow, adoption agencies that don't allow for a non-discrimination policy, meaning that they could claim religious liberty and discriminate in terms of who they would place children with. It's very controversial, and that the right believes it a matter of religious liberty, but the left would say, hey, maybe this would mean, these agencies are getting federal dollars, but they don't have to place, with gay parents or LGBT parents, which obviously some people would view as very anti-family. So I think that's something people should keep an eye on, and maybe, call the members of Congress and tell them what they think about that.
What do you think about it?
Well, in general, I think it's better to have kids with families, and the foster care system is no good. And whatever you think about, LGBT, a family is better than no family. That's what I would say. So.
Okay,
Can
and
I push
Valerie
back on that
Greenfeld.
just a
No,
bit?
we're going straight to your underreported story.
My underreported story is about what's going on in northern Israel in the Golan Heights and Syria. On the border there, Israel has been bringing in all kinds of Syrian civilians for medical treatment, and they have been coming over on a steady stream, and then once they're well, they go back home. The problem now is that the fighting has gotten so bad on the border, particularly with Hezbollah and Hamas, that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel decided to close the border, meaning that nobody can come from Syria into Israel for help anymore. And it's causing a big problem because Israel really does want to help the Syrians. And what country does that, helps their enemies, really, literally, to stay alive? So I feel that they've done an amazing job. The problem now is that they're getting criticized for closing their own border, where on the other side of the border, with Egypt, it's never been open. And so this is a change on the Israeli side where there's not ever been a change. It's never even been open on the other side. So I think people need to look at Israel with a little bit of a better eye in terms of how much humanitarian aid they have been giving in comparison to Egypt, who hasn't given any.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for that. And that is all for this week. I'm Adam Byrne. Thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.